soldiers of fortune, guns for hire, lance knight, private military contractors. Over the years, mercenaries have been known by many names, yet their profession has remained essentially unchanged since time immemorial. They are armed civilians, hired to participate in military operations in foreign lands, often in active combat zones. To some, they offer a more economical and effective alternative to national militaries. To others, they are greedy, soulless killing machines who sell their services to the highest bidder, leaving nothing but death and destruction in their wake. As Niccolò Machiavelli wrote in The Prince, mercenaries are disunited, ambitious, undisciplined, and disloyal, valiant among friends, among enemies, cowardly. They have no fear of God, no loyalty to men. Yet the truth, as so often happens, lies somewhere in between. Pinpointing the first exact mention of mercenaries proves challenging. This difficulty isn't due to a lack of references in early sources, but rather stems from the inherent ambiguity in defining what makes a mercenary. Throughout much of history, professional armies were relatively scarce. Most kingdoms instead depended on citizen militias, serfs serving under the feudal system, and other similar arrangements. As a result, many individuals who were paid to fight in foreign lands under these various systems could technically be classified as mercenaries. Mentions of freelance soldiers, mercenaries paid by a foreign entity to conduct military operations, date back as far as the Bronze Age, with references even appearing in the Old Testament. In Book 1 of Samuel, the future King David sought refuge with Achish, king of Gath, while posing as a traitor to Israel. The Philistine king subsequently hired David as a mercenary, during which time he was paid to raid common enemies of both the Philistines and Israel. Meanwhile, the books of Jeremiah and Ezekiel both make mention of hired swords, one referring to those fighting for Egypt and the other to those battling against them. Additional references to Egypt's relationship with mercenaries are found in a 14th century BC papyrus fragment which depicts a warrior wearing a boar tusk helmet, a common piece of attire for a Mycenaean of that era. Although the papyrus fragment is intriguing, it's not particularly surprising. Greek mercenaries were employed throughout the ancient world, leading modern scholars to describe the period as witnessing an explosion of professional fighters by the 4th century BC. The most famous example from this era is undoubtedly the 10,000. In 401 BC, Cyrus the Younger sought to overthrow his brother, the Persian king Artaxerxes II. To strengthen his already formidable force of 100,000 soldiers, Cyrus hired 10,000 Greek mercenaries before marching toward Babylon. Although he was eventually defeated at the Battle of Canaxa, the Greek sellswords demonstrated their prowess as warriors. Trapped behind enemy lines after the battle, they spent the next 2 years fighting their way through Persia before finally returning to Greece. Less than a century later, Alexander the Great embarked on his own campaign against Persia. Accompanying him were approximately 5,000 foreign freelance fighters, while the Persians themselves fielded a force of around 10,000 Greek mercenaries. This deployment underscored the mercenaries' primary loyalty to coin rather than to any homelands. But the Greeks weren't the only ones to outsource or employ mercenaries. In the years that followed, Rome established a regular practice of hiring these professional soldiers, a strategy that was also adopted by their enemies. Hannibal relied on mercenary forces when he crossed the Alps to march on Rome, while Julius Caesar owed his survival during his campaign against Vercingetorix in Gaul to a group of mercenaries. Time and again, these hired swords proved crucial in battle, standing out as the few truly professional soldiers of the ancient world. Whereas many soldiers returned home to tend to farms, families, and social obligations, mercenaries roamed in search of the next conflict. By 988 AD, mercenaries had become so common that Byzantine Emperor Basil II enlisted a group of Viking warriors as his personal guard. Known as the Varangian Guard, this elite unit went on to protect the Byzantine Emperor for the next 4 centuries, and its ranks even included the future Norwegian king Harald Hardrada. Mercenaries continued to play key roles throughout the Middle Ages. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, nearly half his army consisted of hired swords. A century later, King Henry II frequently employed mercenaries, using them strategically to suppress a rebellion in Normandy while also pacifying Brittany. In 1250, a group of mercenary slaves rose to power in Egypt and Syria, establishing the Mamluk Sultanate, an Islamic dynasty that would endure for nearly 300 years. By the 1500s, mercenaries had become so integral that they even began serving as the Pope's personal protectors through the Swiss Guard, who continue to safeguard the papal office today. However, this era also marked the point when mercenaries increasingly proved problematic for many of their employers. In medieval Italy, cities resembled ancient Greek city-states more than parts of a centralized government. As a result, they were almost constantly at war with one another, often employing forces composed largely of mercenaries. The basic military unit, known as a lance, typically consisted of a mounted knight, a squire, a page, and either 2 archers or men-at-arms. Because these soldiers were often considered free due to their open loyalties, the term freelancer was born, a term that's still used today to describe anyone who is self-employed and earns money on a per-job basis. Unfortunately, although most of these freelancers performed exceptionally well due to their extensive battle experience, they could also become real nuisances during times of peace. As they spread across Europe, these condottieri, or contractors as the Italians called them, fought for the highest bidder and eventually organized into groups known as free companies. Much like modern mercenary groups, the free companies of the time were solely focused on earning money. They were led by a captain who managed the company's finances, while professional men-at-arms filled the ranks and were organized into a hierarchy of commanders and administrators. Soldiers signed contracts specifying how loot would be divided, that is, their paycheck. By the time of the 30 Years' War, in 1618, mercenaries had become the primary source of soldiers on the battlefield, with most combatants being swords for hire. This shift created a new kind of battlefield, one where loyalty to nations, kings, or homelands no longer mattered. Battles, which once involved only a few thousand combatants, now saw armies of up to 100,000, with each side commanding forces equal to those of a small city. When there were no battles to fight, mercenaries often acted like gangs, roaming the countryside to harass, pillage, and rape until they received a new call to action. In the period following the 30 Years' War, mercenaries became somewhat taboo. Their reputation for causing mayhem during peacetime, combined with the rise of nationalism across Europe, contributed to a decline in their popularity. Many nations even began banning soldiers of fortune. Meanwhile, state-sponsored organizations like the British East India Company emerged, though they were a far cry from the independent free companies of the past. Similarly, privateers who roamed the high seas were initially commissioned and organized by a crown. Occasionally, monarchs would lend forces to one another, for example, when the German sovereign sent troops in support of King George III in the American colonies, but this was more an act of alliance than the deployment of a mercenary force. For the most part, mercenaries largely disappeared from the public eye for several centuries, operating independently around the globe until the onset of World War II. While mercenaries had largely faded into obscurity by the turn of the 20th century, occasional exceptions served as vivid reminders of their continued existence. One notable example was Claire Lee Chennault, a former US Army pilot. After retiring in 1937, he quickly secured a position with the Chinese Air Force. Here, he not only served as an advisor, but also effectively commanded the force. Chennault negotiated a deal with the United States to supply China with 100 Curtiss P-40 fighter planes and persuaded President Theodore Roosevelt to allocate 99 US military pilots to fly them. Together, these pilots formed the American Volunteer Group, more commonly known as the Flying Tigers. To accept these roles, the pilots had to formally resign from the US military, effectively becoming mercenaries, a transition they likely welcomed, as their new salaries were reportedly double those of their previous positions. However, when the US entered World War II, the Flying Tigers were integrated into the US Army Air Forces. In the aftermath of the war, decolonization, especially in Africa, gave rise to unstable governments, geopolitical hotspots, and war-torn nations, creating fertile ground for freelance soldiers. To put this into perspective, between 1956 and 2001, Africa alone experienced 80 successful coups, 108 failed coups, and 139 similar plots across sub-Saharan countries. Amid this turmoil, foreign mercenaries not only provided training to local forces, but also offered invaluable logistical and combat support. Even more troubling was the significant involvement of former Nazis who had escaped wartime persecution and were active in various parts of the Third World. These individuals became spies for the Soviets, freelance arm traffickers, and were even integrated into the United States intelligence community. The most famous example is Werner von Braun, the former Nazi who later helped launch the US into space as NASA's director. But many others followed a similar path. Both the CIA and the US Army's counterintelligence corps actively sought out former SS and Gestapo members for recruitment. Between the Cold War and the ongoing turmoil in Africa and other regions, the latter half of the 20th century emerged as another golden age for mercenaries. In a familiar twist of history, these combatants began forming their own organizations, a trend that would eventually lead to the development of private military companies, or PMCs. The first modern-era PMC, Watchguard International, was founded in 1965 by former British Special Forces officers John Woodhouse and David Stirling, who had established the SAS more than 20 years earlier. While many mercenaries and PMCs were simply providing the services for which they were paid, their rapid global expansion raised significant concerns. Moreover, these combatants operated with minimal regulation, accountable only to those who financed them, thereby creating a Wild West atmosphere wherever they went. This growing concern led to the adoption of the Geneva Protocols 1 and 2 in 1977. Although these protocols did not explicitly ban the use of mercenaries, they defined who could be considered a mercenary and imposed limitations on their rights. Under these protocols, mercenaries were denied the status of both combatants and prisoners of war, along with the privileges associated with those statuses. At the same time, the African Union sponsored the Convention for the Elimination of Mercenarism in Africa, also launched in 1977, as part of a global effort to criminalize mercenary activities entirely. This initiative gained further support from the United Nations in 1989 with the adoption of the International Convention Against the Recruitment, Use, Financing, and Training of Mercenaries. The process culminated in UN Resolution 4434, which officially banned the use of mercenaries and came into force in 2001. While many expected a rapid decline in the use of mercenaries worldwide after the ban, 2001 marked an unexpected turning point. In the 21st century, soldiers of fortune once again became a central element of warfare. Although mercenaries were prohibited under the referenced UN resolution, private military companies and private security companies were not subject to the same restrictions. Their operatives, commonly known as private military contractors, were similarly exempt. This important distinction was quickly exploited by the United States. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the US felt compelled to act swiftly, deploying troops to Afghanistan and Iraq. Yet the government soon encountered a range of challenges in waging the war on terror. The high costs of maintaining overseas forces, shifting public opinion, issues of deniability and legal liabilities all presented significant obstacles that demanded creative and flexible solutions. To address these challenges, the US began increasingly relying on PMCs and PSCs for nearly every aspect of its overseas operations. They provided base security, VIP protection, training for foreign troops, logistical support, and, of course, combat services. By 2011, these modern mercenaries had become so ubiquitous that their numbers in Afghanistan and Iraq equaled those of uniformed military personnel. By 2019, they even outnumbered US military forces by 50%. Although most PMCs in these regions performed support roles, with only around 15% serving as combatants, the overall presence of private contractors was still staggering. In 2020, reports showed that while the US maintained roughly 2,500 troops in each of Afghanistan and Iraq, and about 900 in Syria, more than 27,000 contractors were deployed across these three theaters of operation. This disparity highlights a significant gap between the number of soldiers and PMCs, even as companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin also provide contract-based services to the US government. What remains undeniable, however, is that between 2001 and 2021, the Pentagon spent over $14 trillion on war efforts, with roughly a third to a half of that sum going to private contractors. While the United States is undoubtedly, at least in part, responsible for the modern resurgence of mercenaries, it's far from the only country employing them. The United Kingdom, for example, is estimated to spend around £50 million or $65 million annually on private military companies. However, the UK has arguably become more renowned for creating these companies rather than directly employing them. Watchguard International, the first PMC to emerge from the UK, set the stage for many that followed. A 2018 report revealed that at least 235 PMCs and private security companies were registered in the UK, including prominent firms like G4S and Aegis Defence Services. Meanwhile, mercenaries continue to be a common presence throughout sub-Saharan Africa, largely financed by Russia and China, both of which have made significant strides in the PMC sector in recent years. In Nigeria, the government enlisted mercenaries to drive Boko Haram out of the country in just a few weeks, a task that had eluded them for the previous 6 years. Similarly, the Middle East remains a hotspot for mercenary activity. The United Arab Emirates, for example, has employed mercenaries primarily from Latin American countries to fight in Yemen, Syria, and Libya. In Kurdistan, local oil companies and Kurdish militias frequently hire mercenaries not only for protection of their interests, but also to track down regional terrorists. However, mercenaries have also found employment with terrorist groups. One prominent example is Malhama Tactical, a PMC based in Uzbekistan that exclusively sells its services to jihadist extremists. Organizations such as Nusra Front and Al-Qaeda affiliations, the Turkestan Islamic Party, hire Malhama Tactical much like a government would hire any PMC. Their operatives receive payment to train soldiers, manage arms deals, or engage in combat wherever they are directed. Despite their associations with extremist groups, organizations like these have rarely been linked to atrocities or even mentioned in the news. Instead, it's primarily American and Russian-backed mercenaries that have drawn significant backlash over the years. Blackwater was an American PMC founded in 1998 by Eric Prince, a former US Navy SEAL. With the onset of the War on Terror, it quickly became one of the United States' preferred contractors, offering security, technical, and logistical support wherever America was active. However, in 2001, a controversial incident in Baghdad, Iraq, thrust Blackwater into the public spotlight, forcing the company to confront significant scrutiny for the first time. According to Blackwater agents, after a car bomb exploded near a meeting between US and Iraqi officials, they were ordered to evacuate the American personnel. When they reached Nasser Square, the agents claimed that a suspicious Kia was approaching, posing a potential threat. Despite repeated orders to stop, the driver allegedly ignored the commands, prompting the agents to open fire. The driver and passenger were killed, and according to the agents, a group of Iraqi individuals, reportedly numbering between 8 and 10, then fired upon them. However, the Iraqi government, which concluded its own investigation, disputed this account. Their findings indicated that the driver and passenger were a civilian mother and her son who were simply driving on the wrong side of the road. According to the Iraqi report, the subsequent gunfire came from local police and military personnel who misunderstood the situation and began firing at the Blackwater agents. What remains indisputable is at least 14 Iraqi civilians lost their lives, with many more injured in an event that would later be known as the Nasser Square massacre. Despite multiple court proceedings in the years that followed and widespread calls for justice from the Arab world, only 4 Blackwater agents were ultimately held accountable. In 2020, however, President Donald Trump pardoned all 4: Paul Slough, Evan Liberty, Dustin Hurd, and Nicholas Slarton. Although Blackwater has undergone several rebrandings over the years, it still operates today as Academy, a subsidiary of Constellus with around 20,000 operatives worldwide. Meanwhile, its founder, Eric Prince, continues to make headlines despite severing ties with the company after selling it in 2010. Through his other ventures, Prince has faced accusations of violating the arms embargo on Libya and of supplying weapons to a rogue general, which led to an FBI investigation. Prior to that, he campaigned relentlessly to privatize the Afghanistan war. In 2017, Prince proposed a plan he believed could end the conflict, involving $5 billion annually, 6,000 of his own troops, and essentially unrestricted control over Afghanistan, an idea that was quickly dismissed as unrealistic. However, given Prince's reported closeness to the Trump administration, many feared the White House might actually entertain his proposal. In 2025, he and others began pushing a $25 billion plan to privatize the mass deportation of 12 million migrants from the United States, illustrating just how far he and other mercenaries will go for a payday. Yet as chilling as Prince's ambitions, and by extension Blackwater's, may be, they pale in comparison to the lengths a Russian-based PMC would go to. The story of the Wagner Group is both recent and extraordinarily violent, even by the high standards of private military companies. Founded in 2014 by Yevgeny Prigozhin, a Russian oligarch with diverse business interests in oil, diamonds, and more, the group quickly gained traction. Prigozhin deployed his troops across nations in the Middle East and Africa, often exchanging military support for access to natural resources. This strategy enabled Wagner to rise swiftly, establishing itself as one of the world's leading PMCs. However, as the group expanded its operations, so did its notorious reputation. In the Central African Republic, Human Rights Watch has documented multiple instances of torture, mistreatment, and the murder of civilians by the Wagner Group. These accusations have been echoed in countries such as Mali, Syria, and other locations where the group operates. In 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Wagner Group emerged as a key player in the conflict. However, at that time, Wagner lacked enough soldiers to meet Russia's demands, leading the group to begin recruiting inmates from the country's prisons that summer. While Wagner's experienced soldiers continued to operate in Africa and Syria, the new and experienced recruits were sent to Ukraine as cannon fodder. The group's involvement in Ukraine drew increasing public scrutiny, with Pope Francis even condemning the use of mercenaries in the conflict. Nonetheless, during this period, Wagner would also prove problematic for Russia. For one, Wagner's founder Prigozhin was frequently at odds with high-ranking members of the Russian military. In addition, although the group was paid nearly $1 billion a year for its first year of operations in Ukraine, it maintained that Russia still owed it money. Moreover, Prigozhin incurred the Kremlin's ire when he publicly declared that the invasion of Ukraine was unjustified, directly contradicting the Russian government's official stance. Whether driven by a combination of these factors or by his own ambitions, Prigozhin shifted his focus to Russia itself in June 2023, leading a force of 25,000 troops. Marching on Moscow, he seized control of military facilities in Rostov-on-Don along the way. However, just a few hundred miles from Moscow, Prigozhin's forces unexpectedly withdrew. Although the precise reason remains unclear, it is believed that he reached some sort of agreement with Putin, a deal that likely granted him immunity from criminal charges. Yet, only 2 months after Wagner's insurrection, Prigozhin was killed in a suspicious plane crash, with many speculating that Putin had orchestrated the hit. In the aftermath, Prigozhin's son, Pavel, took control of the Wagner Group, which subsequently returned to Russia's service and resumed its previous missions on behalf of the nation. However, this did not mark the end of the group's controversy. In Mali, Wagner has earned an especially notorious reputation. While pursuing the extremist Islamic group Katiba Messina in 2022, Wagner, alongside other forces, was accused of killing approximately 500 civilians in just 4 days. Then, between May and December 2024, reports emerged that the group had deliberately killed at least 32 civilians, made 4 people vanish, and burned over 100 homes across the country. Moreover, there have been persistent accounts of rape, torture, looting, and other atrocities wherever Wagner operates, with their conduct often resembling that of common thugs rather than professional soldiers. Yet, as we've seen, this issue is not unique to Wagner. Mercenaries present a global problem, with such abuses occurring in nearly every corner of the world. So look, while nations like Russia and the US continue to make headlines for their use of mercenaries, the issue extends far beyond these countries to every corner of the globe. In regions such as the Middle East, Africa, and now Ukraine, mercenaries have once again become a widespread presence. Even nations that have long remained distant from this controversy are now getting involved with PMCs. As civilians, these contractors allow governments to distance themselves from actions that are, at times, horrific. As soldiers, they roam the world, instilling fear in those whose homes they invade, while employing torture, murder, and everything in between. Despite being rebranded as PMCs, PSCs, and other labels, they remain mercenaries, much like their forebears, operating like common street gangs wherever they are deployed. Thank you for watching.